Well, Lenny or Mr. Harper, it's the morning after the night before of the documentary filmed, broadcast on BBC Four last night, 10 o'clock. What's your initial thoughts of it?
Well, I think, Neil, that what stood out for me starkly in the film was the complete contrast between the dignity and the courage that the survivors showed in relating their experiences and the smug arrogance of the group that just wanted to denigrate everything that had happened to them and what they were saying. You know, you had Frank Walker, who could not disguise his absolute hatred for anybody who disagreed with his version of events. You had Jimmy Pershard, who just showed himself to be an absolute bully and somebody who can't use words to express how he feels, and instead had to say that he would have loved to have punched Stewart, or he felt he should have punched him, just showed his shortcomings. David Rose somehow managed to look even more creepy than he normally does, and trying to minimise what Jimmy Savile had done, and it must be remembered that this is not the first time he's tried to minimise abuse of children. He called the North Wales care home abuse a scam, and he defended the Leicestershire rapist Frank Beck. And so last night was just par for the course, and he did himself in their argument no favours at all with his minimisation of what Jimmy Savile had done. And I find it difficult to express the contempt that I have for that Mr. Higham, the man at the lab who betrayed the trust of the police and the survivors and the victims when he leaked false information, wrong information to David Rose, when he knew that David Rose was a denier of child abuse. So, when you look at that and you look at the way that the survivors, Carrie and all the rest of them, put their experiences across, it was a stark contrast. And I think for me, that's what really stood out
Yeah,
in the film. And I suppose I should say that I had my reservations, not about Camilla or anybody else, Leah or any of the rest of them who did work on the film in the months and years just gone by. I had reservations once the BBC became involved, because we know how we've experienced the BBC. With one or two notable exceptions, the BBC were on the side of the abusers and those who were trying to cover up for them. And so I had severe reservations when I heard that the BBC had got involved. But I was wrong, because I think they did a pretty good job. And I think it was very clever the way they put the evidence there, and left the public to make their own minds up. And anybody watching the performance of Walker and Pershard and the rest of them would have had no difficulty, I think, in coming to a conclusion as to where the truth lay.
yeah. I think because people won't know this. This started off as an independent film when I and I know yourself agreed to take part in it. It was an independent film. It was going to be a multi-episode documentary. How it started off, but it came out that the BBC commissioned it, and I, like yourself, I was not happy. I wanted out. I would never have signed up to anything the BBC were going to do for the reasons you've just outlined. But it croaks me to say it. I've got to give credit to where it's due. To the filmmaker, certainly Camilla Hall, Rogan Productions, and the BBC. I think, how do you tell the Jersey story in 90 minutes? Do you think do you think they told that story in that 90 minutes?
Well, as you infer, you just cannot get to the whole truth in a 90-minute documentary film when you look at everything that happened there. But I do think they did an excellent job in pointing the viewer towards the whole truth. And the way they presented the evidence, and the way they left it there, and they made a point, and then they put both sides of the argument. And for instance, when we were talking about the where Gradwell and Warcup went to great pains to try and blacken the investigation that had gone before by saying we can absolutely categorically say there were no murders. And what they were saying was that we were telling lies. Well, then the filmmakers last night quite clearly showed that, in fact, we were saying we didn't have the evidence for a homicide prior. We didn't have the evidence to say there were any murders, but the abuse sure as hell took place, and a lot of other questionable activities as well surrounding the bones and the teeth that were found. And you can't, in a 90-minute documentary, you cannot expect to get every aspect of it. There are a lot of aspects here which would have even further further rammed home the point with it, further evidence about the attitude of Walker, Pershard, Gradwell, and Warcup, and David Rose. But it just couldn't be covered in 90 minutes. I've had so many, at least half a dozen people message me today saying, write the book, write the book.
Yeah.
And it may take a book to set out in great detail exactly how these people connived to bury the story of the abuse that went on in these government-sponsored homes.
Because the big question here is, if you remember at the time, Mick Gradwell, you couldn't get him off your bloody tally at one stage when he was over here trashing the investigation and everything. And of course, I don't know if he was asked to take part in this film. I'm sure he was, and David Walkup. Well, where the bloody hell were they? You and Mr. Graham Power, the former chief of police, was there. Where was Gradwell and Walkup?
Well, that's a very good question, and if you, it reminds me of a phrase that was used in relation to another TV interview in the last week or so. Your truth, where was their truth? It was nowhere to be seen. And and of course the questions there to be asked: why did they destroy all the exhibits? There was hardly any mention of the teeth that they threw away. The bones, there was no mention of the fleshed and fresh bones that were sent, which an anthropologist, a respected anthropologist, said were fresh and fleshed whenever they were burnt and hidden at Hotel Garenne. And it would be nice to see those questions being asked of Gradwell and Warcup. But as I say, you just can't fit it all into a 90-minute documentary, and I thought the producers and the filmmakers did extremely well.
Yeah, I suppose, again, my gripe, again, I know you agree with me on this, that the local state media, as we call them, I was at pains to say to the filmmaker, when we were being filmed, look, I didn't want to blog. That this wasn't my decision to blog. Myself and Rico Sora and others, it was because the mainstream media over here were basically complicit in the cover-up. That unfortunately didn't come across in the film, did it?
No, it probably didn't, because there were so many blatant examples where they were caught out. Like, for instance, just to mention two of them. Before I ever mentioned Sellers in the media, the Jersey Evening Post were asking me about Sellers. But then when the news broke and all the rest of it, we were getting blamed for calling them sellers, and the state media in Jersey were calling them voids in the floorboards, as Mr. Warkup or Mr. Gradwell were telling them. The other aspect was in relation to the fines of the shackles. You remember the abuse that I took personally over the issue of the shackles, where I was accused of whipping up hysteria by referring to shackles. But in actual fact, when I emerged from the home on the day that we found these, I refused to clarify what we had found. And it was a reporter on the Jersey Evening Post, a female reporter whose name I remember well, who actually said to me, "What about the shackles that you found?" So they knew, they'd spoken to the builders who had found those shackles 5 years before. So the Jersey Evening Post were the first ones to mention shackles, but a couple of months later, that same reporter ran a story bitterly criticizing me for raising hysteria over the shackles when it was her that mentioned it in the first place. So none of this was mentioned, and the mainstream state media in Jersey got off extremely lightly. And some of the media were criticized for the hysterical headlines, which, when you look at some of the headlines, was a fair point. Although I noticed that one or two of the Jersey headlines about champagne lifestyles and celebrity lifestyles were flashed up on screen. But none of the facts surrounding their twisting of the truth and their downright lying were raised in it. And it's perhaps, again, maybe the 90-minute documentary syndrome, but one wouldn't like to think that it was because that they didn't want to upset their colleagues in the mainstream media. But again, as I say, it's difficult in a 90-minute documentary.
Yeah, and of course, we got to remember that Graham Powers, because another little gripe, we've got to look at this objectively. That it came up in the text that Graham Powers, what Graham Power was criticised in a police report. But before we get on to that, what we got to remember is Graham Power wrote a 62,000 word response to that report. I'll let you tell us what that report was in a minute. But it was leaked. Graham's Power's defence to that report was leaked to all the island media who had reported on the prosecution case against the former chief of police. But when they were leaked the defence case, they buried it. You tell us what the Wiltshire, what that criticism, where that criticism of Graham Power come. What was that about?
Well, it was flashed up on the screen, wasn't it? That Mr. Power was later criticised by another police force for his handling of Operation Rectangle, and that was actually, I thought that was probably the only part of the documentary that I could actually seriously take issue with, because they left it hanging there. What they didn't say was that Wiltshire police were totally discredited. And that, Wiltshire police even went after their own chief constable, who had the nerve to speak about child abuse. And the Wiltshire report was full of inaccuracies. And a number of Jersey police officers later on to the independent inquiry, including members of my team, said that they were intimidated by Wiltshire police into making statements for that Wiltshire inquiry. And that, that was something else that the independent inquiry recorded. That it's there in the inquiry report, in the statements. I know at least two officers who quite explicitly said that they had been intimidated into making the statements that they made to the Wiltshire inquiry. Now, that should have been, if they were going to put if the makers were going to put the fact that Graham had been criticised by another police force on the screen, they should have addressed that. It's may well be an oversight, and I don't want to be too critical of it, because it's the only thing really I can find fault with. But it was an unfair, intentionally or unintentionally, it was very unfair, particularly when the source of the criticism was a police force who themselves were vastly discredited. And I go back to the example where they were criticising our handling of the press, and they appointed either one or two, I can't remember what it was, detectives to trawl through every single press interview and statement that we made. And at the end of the day, they had to report that we hadn't said anything that had been alleged that we had said in relation to murders. But that didn't appear in the Wiltshire report. It was totally left out. So, Graham, that was in Graham's statement of defence.
That's right.
And other bits and pieces like that Graham raised and demolished in the Wiltshire report, and all that was left out, and that was a scandal, one of the many scandals perpetrated by the Jersey media in respect of this particularly bad example of child abuse, and it's difficult to forget that.
Well, I think it came across as if it was an independent police report when it wasn't. It was there to find fault. It was there as a prosecution case in a disciplinary case that never happened. And the state media buried so that does need to be cleared up.
And it was never going to happen, was it? It was never going to happen, because it was built on lies. It was built on a foundation of lies, like quicksand. Fabricated documents and altered documents and falsehoods. It was never ever. It was the whole sham was organised, stalled for time in the hope that this would all blow over and that it would just go away. And of course, thanks to yourself, Rico, and the others that I mentioned on my release on the social media, it didn't go away. And it's now beating them about the head in the way that they were using falsehood and lies to beat us about the head. The truth is now beating them.
I think for another perspective, I don't want to be beating up on the film, but again, I've got to be objective with it. We've got to stay true to the story that we've been have been all the way through the years. Is that he was mentioned, the former Home Affairs Minister Andrew Lewis, out of the hundreds of people who gave evidence to the Care inquiry, the hundreds of witnesses, he was the only one that they called a liar over the suspension of the former Chief Police Graham Power. I don't think that was, I think they could have picked up on that a little bit more because, he was the only one with the power to suspend the former chief police, and it was found to be a pack of lies as a why. So, they didn't come across, did it?
No, well, Andrew Lewis, of course, is the man who stood. My wife frequently and continually tells everybody the story about him standing with his arm around me in the lieutenant governor's residence not long before I left the island. In fact, about 3 nights, I think, putting his arm around me and saying, "This man and I stood shoulder to shoulder fighting against child abuse and the cover-up." And then a couple of days later, he's bad mouthing everybody that was involved in the investigation. And as for the people being labelled liars and all the rest of it, one of the worst aspects last night was the weasel-like appearance of Philip Balash. I mean, my wife laughed out loud when it flashed up on the screen that 9 years after he said it, he apologized if his words had been misunderstood on the Liberation Day speech. Misunderstood? They were never misunderstood. It was a deliberate attempt to try and save the reputation of the island and himself. I mean, if anything, he was worse, I think, than his brother, who was the Attorney General. There was a sleekedness and a craftiness and just a complete refusal to acknowledge the truth in what he was saying. The independent inquiry didn't really do justice to his part in the denigration of the survivors and the investigation.
Yeah, I think they said we don't accept your juxtaposition of words. I think so. Basically, what they were saying, as good as they were saying, we don't believe you. We
Yeah.
don't believe
Well,
what you said.
they should have come out and said, "You're telling lies. We
Yeah,
don't believe you."
yeah,
It's nonsense. I mean, absolute nonsense.
yeah. And of course, it was good to see, with the sellers we've seen former deputy and former Metropolitan Police Officer Bob Hill, the work that he done, Carrie Modrell, the fantastic work she done at the Jersey Care Leavers Association, obviously Marina, the late and very sad Miss Danny Jarman.
Yeah.
It was
I
good
mean,
to see them
they,
getting some recognition.
they were brilliant. They were brilliant. Such courage, such dignity. I was doing a job, and I'm very, very proud to be associated with them all, and yourself, Enrico, and all of those who have had the courage to stand up on the island. I mean, I'm many, many miles away, and I don't have to face it on a daily basis, but it needs repeating over and over and over again. The courage and the bravery, the dignity shown by everybody, all of the survivors, and Danny Jarman tragically, and those who supported them, yourself, Rico, the Pittmans, and Stuart Sivry, who obviously has been targeted again and again and again, and it's just amazing that the courage and the bravery that was shown by all of you last night in that film.
And it goes with the courage and bravery of you and Graham Power, but for taking this on and policing like you're supposed to police without fear or favour. None of this would have happened if you paid big sacrifices for it yourselves. So to finish on, how do you think this would be viewed? I think it was good that the film itself could portray that and show the survivors their story, like you said at the beginning of this interview. It did the survivors proud, and any feedback I've had so far from the survivors is that that they're very happy that their story was told. Do you think the establishment or the bad guys and everything, how do you think they're going to view this film?
Well, well, their arrogance will not allow themselves to be self-critical. But let's face it, the film did not have to be overtly critical of them. They condemned themselves out of their own mouths. I couldn't believe it as I was watching it. I couldn't believe it when Pershaw says he should have punched Stewart. You know, Frank Walker, the arrogance that shone through, and when he said, "Oh, Harper had to go," and Power had, and Power was allowed Harper to run riot, and allowed me to run riot, and trying to get the voice of people who had been horrifically abused throughout the years. And they just condemned themselves out of their mouth. From them to Warcup and Gradwell, to David Rose, to the man who betrayed the trust and leaked information, which then ended up proved to be false. And that's the other aspect of it as well, too. It wasn't made clear in the documentary. Higham took the credit, if you can call it that, for labeling Jar 6 a piece of coconut. Let's not forget that a world-famous anthropologist had identified that exhibit, which although was found later not to be within the terms of our inquiry, she found it to be a piece of human bone. When it came back, she noticed that it had changed in texture, colour and size, and so she couldn't be as sure. It was never positively identified as a coconut. And of course, collagen was found in it. Higham himself said collagen was found in it. So he never mentioned that last night, and yet he wanted to take the credit for saying this was a piece of coconut. What a load of balderdash.
But of course,
hypocritical balderdash.
Yeah.
The whole lot of them. I get angry when I even think about it.
But of course, because Jar 6, the child's skull, wasn't audited when it left Jersey, what Higham did analyse could have been a piece of coconut.
Well, I think that what Higham analysed at the outset undoubtedly was Jar 6, because they found quite a large amount of collagen in it.
Right, yeah.
And as you know, collagen is only found in mammals, including humans. There's no collagen in coconut. There's no collagen in wood. The problem arose when Higham sent it out, and it was passed through God knows how many people without there being any audit trail whatsoever. So goodness knows what came back again. Goodness knows when it was, because it quite clearly must have been substituted if you look at the facts surrounding it. If the anthropologist at the outset identified it, and this is an anthropologist who's been used in significant murder inquiries all over the world, she identified it as a piece of human bone. And when it comes back, she notes that it's changed. She couldn't say outright that it wasn't the same piece because she had no evidence that it had been changed, but she looked at it and she says, "Oh, it's a different size, it's a different color, it's a different texture." Well, perhaps maybe the color could change when it was exposed, this or that. How did the size change? I mean, how did the size of the piece change? And it was as you said in the documentary last night. Nobody ever asked that question. Nobody asked the question: how did it go out, be examined, collagen found in it, and then no record kept of where it went? It was some technician who's not qualified to do anything with it who said, "Oh, it looks like a piece of coconut to me," and that was seized upon. So
the media jumped all over that, didn't it? And then,
and they're still using it. They're still using it. They're just refusing to look at the evidence and refusing to look at all the facts.
And of course, whilst everybody's talking about that nonsense, and we'll talk about how much you paid for a bloody meal or a prawn cocktail in a restaurant. Of course.
Listen, I've been getting a headache from my wife all day. Who wants to know why she wasn't included in this celebrity lifestyle.
But that's what it was, And of course, thanks to former Deputy Trevor Pittman and former Deputy Daniel Wimberley and Roy Larissieff, I remember with the BDO report, they showed that the media just went after you and misrepresented the report.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you bear in mind that we built an incident room and we put a lot of electronic equipment into that incident room. We had very expensive experts in the UK. We had plant machinery. We dug up Hotel Garenne, and yet we still spent less than what Warcup and Gradwell spent after they arrived. How can that be? Nobody asked, and I would love to have seen that asked. A great percentage of that probably went on the Wiltshire inquiry.
Yeah, well, the Wiltshire Inquiry didn't. The Wiltshire Inquiry itself was, I think, about 1.5 million in the end.
Well, that's about half of what I think. That's about half of what we spent on the whole inquiry.
yeah, but there's a lot of questions. I think a lot of questions were answered last night. To be fair, the film, I think it did the survivors justice. It did everybody justice. It tried to give both sides of the story, and people will have to make up their own minds with it.
Well, I'm all I can say is I'm very grateful on behalf of the whole investigation team, but most of all, the survivors, yourselves, that the Storyville production team, Camilla and Leah at some stage, all managed between them to get the story of the survivors out there, get their story with clarity, with truth, with dignity. They did it, and they did wonders within the confines of a 90-minute documentary. We could pick little bits out and find fault with them, but I don't think that would be right. They did a fabulous job, I think, within the confines of a 90-minute documentary. If nothing else, they pointed the public in the direction of where the truth really lies.
I think I agree with you, Lenny. I do agree with that. You can't tell this story in 90 minutes. It's an impossibility because it's an ongoing story, and it can go down all sorts of rabbit holes. But well, we've done 26 minutes here, so we hope we've kept people interested as far as, and I'm sure we'll do some follow-ups in the future. And I want to thank you, Graham Power, the team of Operation Rectangle, because there was a team of you, for the work you did for the survivors. And we will hopefully have a catch up again soon.
Yeah, and just the last word is that I'm absolutely delighted for the survivors and for those who didn't make it.
Thanks, Lenny.
Okay, Neil.